Yes.
Is that because they add yeast or because there's yeast already somehow?
Typically they add yeast. They have a purified strain of yeast that they use. So if any of you are ever interested and old enough to go, there's a wine vineyard in Grapevine called Delaney Vineyards. You can go there and you can actually get the grand tour of how they make the wine. And what you do is you go into this room where they have these gigantic canisters. And in the bottom of those canisters, they literally just have pounds and pounds and pounds of yeast. And they add in the grapes and everything after they've basically squashed them and extracted the juices, and then let that ferment with the yeast for a certain amount of time. The yeast are going to use the sugars in those grapes to start to produce certain amounts of alcohol. And then you can extract the juice alcohol mixture, and you've got wine. Okay? And then you then put that into barrels and allow it to age for a certain amount of time to taste on some of the properties, the scents and flavors of the wood. And after it's sat for a long enough amount of time and aged the right way, then you bottle it and make it with wine. Ideally, that's how it works. And you technically also made alcohol last week when you were performing your lab. You just didn't drink it, okay? You put those yeast into, or you put yeast with glucose or sucrose into those fermentation tubes. You let them sit. They produce carbon dioxide in the upper portion of those fermentation tubes. But what you might not have known is down in the lower portion of those fermentation tubes, they were actually generating alcohol. Everybody's like, we're going to go eat. Yes, Don?
For the lactic acid fermentation, what is the biological reason why we build it up? Like, why can't our muscles get rid of it when we do anaerobic exercise?
Why do we do? Well, typically what happens is initially when you start exercising, the amount of force and energy required for your body is too much to make initially with oxidative phosphorylation, because it takes a while for those initial glucose molecules to start being utilized by, or not the glucose molecules, but the NADHs that are made from the glucose through glycolysis and the citric acid cycle to actually get to the mitochondrion so you can start performing oxidative phosphorylation. Additionally, you might not have the appropriate amount of oxygen you need either. So what you need is you need a short burst of energy that doesn't take a lot of time and can basically tide you over for that initial point in time when you're exercising. And that's where fermentation comes into play. While lactic acid is really bad for your muscles, it also is a quick way for us to generate enough energy to tide us over until oxidative phosphorylation begins to occur.
But then that's why you hit a wall eventually, like if you're in a marathon or so, with the lactic acid buildup.
Yes. Well, what's eventually going to happen is it's going to be so taxing that your body's literally going to start to perform both types of respiration at any given point in time, along with fermentation, so that you can just make and maximize however much energy you need. And depending upon where the stress is, depending upon what's going on in those muscles, also understand that the more and more lactic acid you start to build up, the less and less oxygen is going to be able to get to the areas where it might need to get, the more you're going to need to start performing anaerobic processes to provide energy for those muscle cells. But yes, you should stretch after and before exercising, and you should attempt as best you can to work any and all lactic acid out, because it's not good for your muscles to leave it where it is. And it's typically what causes most of the discomfort that's associated with soreness and pain after exercise for an extended period of time. Okay. Now, what you need to understand about all of this is glycolysis is the key. It is the starting stage where we can branch off into either direction. The end of glycolysis, when you form that pyruvate, you aren't necessarily going to go into oxidative phosphorylation. You could just as easily utilize those molecules of pyruvate to perform fermentation. Okay? So glycolysis is really the fork of the road. And depending upon the stress on the cells, depending upon the amount of energy required, depending upon how much time those cells have to provide the body or organism with that energy, is going to probably have an effect on which type of process you perform, an anaerobic one or an aerobic one. Now, there are other kinds of organisms that can be classified as obligate anaerobes or facultative anaerobes. perform fermentation or anaerobic respiration, but they will not and cannot survive in an environment that has oxygen. But most yeast and bacteria are typically going to be the alternate kind, which are called facultative anaerobes, which means they can survive using either fermentation or cellular respiration, and it can be either aerobic or anaerobic respiration. Okay? So there's glycolysis, there's the pyruvate, and there's the branching path. If there's no oxygen present, those facultative anaerobes are going to perform fermentation. If there is oxygen present, then they're going to perform aerobic cellular respiration. Interestingly enough, we can actually take the mitochondria out of yeast, and the yeast will survive. If we were to do that to ourselves, not so likely. Okay? Because yeast are a single-celled organism, they're going to survive, but what they do find is when they do that, the yeast colonies are very, very small compared to what they are when the yeast are able to perform aerobic respiration. Okay.